I'm now joined by Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited, to help us make sense of what comes next. Brendan, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. What comes next? As much as we want to think that what comes next will come out of the not tweets, Truth Social posts from the President of the United States, I think to borrow from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the solution is not in the stars, but in ourselves. But we can talk about that.
Well, that was very well said. I think Shakespeare would be very happy. But what would be the immediate consequences for Canadian businesses if CUSMA were to be terminated?
Well, it's really hard to say. I mean, you can say, the U.S. has said they're not going to renew the agreement. That's all they've said so far. So it's subject to a 16-year renewal. I guess they did it originally in 1994. Then they renewed it in, 2010. And so it was up for renewal again for another 16 years. And now they're going to go through the whole process of negotiating it so that every year people have to decide whether they want to stay in it. That all having been said, the Americans can withdraw, or anybody, we could withdraw, Mexicans could withdraw from it with a 6-month notice period. So it does put a bit of a sword of Damocles over it. And I think it's going to really depend on the industry, and it really depends on how Canada as a nation responds. So there was much talk and in reality, businesses were lost when the free trade agreement came in. Global multinationals, U.S. companies that had branch plants that manufactured here in Canada, everything from bottling to, everything, decided now we'll just centralize in the U.S. or we'll move it to Mexico or we'll do something like that. On the other hand, there are a lot of competitive advantages that we have in Canada, not least of which is our much maligned healthcare system. We forget how vastly expensive it is to buy healthcare insurance in the United States. People can't leave their jobs in the U.S. because they need to hang on to their healthcare. It has nothing to do with vacation days or even employment salaries, but it's about healthcare. So the fact that healthcare is, while imperfect, more or less free, is an advantage to hiring people up here and makes it considerably cheaper. The fact our dollar is cheaper, hovering around 70 cents, makes it a relatively attractive prospect if you have to pay people in loonies rather than in greenbacks, rather than US dollars. So I think it's going to depend on the industry. What will depend on us, to go back to my earlier comment, is whether we want to, as a nation, work on this together, whether we can set aside regional, provincial differences like the tariffs to move goods back and forth, like the prohibitions on professionals in one trade union or professional organization in one province transferring to another. The fact we've set up these internal barriers has made it difficult for us to compete on a continental scale, let alone a global scale. And if we're going to do it more on our own, I think we will need to, as a country, think about our resources, the chief of which is our people. Yes, we have oil and gold and molybdenum and goodness knows what else we have in the ground, but our chief resource is people. How do we empower our people to make the most of this fantastic platform that we have that's called Canada?
Well, and on empowering people, in the clip we just heard from Melanie Joly, she said that Canada has a plan. And we've heard the Carney government a few times say that Canada has a plan, and to almost ease the anxiety that Canadians are feeling around what's going to happen with CUSMA and with trade with the United States in general. But how vulnerable are Canadian jobs to prolonged trade uncertainty?
Well, I think some are vulnerable, but new ones will be created. If there are actual trade barriers going up, then what didn't make sense to produce in Canada for the Canadian market or in Canada for the international market might make sense going forward. So in as much as when the free trade agreement came in, jobs were lost because businesses moved to the US or Mexico and figured they could serve the whole North American market from there. Other businesses came up to Canada for exactly the same reason And now, if these trade barriers go up between our nations, I think there are barriers to too many. There are barriers to the barriers going up. I think it would be inconvenient for a lot of American companies to have to rethink their whole supply chain. But we can come to that. I think Canada, if it's going to do it more on its own, then we have to get serious about doing it on its own. And no single province can do it, let alone do it if they decide to separate. So, to borrow from a father in the American Revolution, if we do not hang together, we shall all surely hang separately.
Now, Brendan, as you mentioned, Canada does have a lot to offer. But what would you say Canada's strongest bargaining chips are in these negotiations that we really should be pushing out to Mexico and the United States and using it as a bargaining chip?
Well, I think a few things. One, we do have a cost advantage over certain aspects of the United States. I mentioned healthcare just being one, the Canadian dollar being another. Um, Another, we do have tremendous amount of natural resources. I do worry about the fact that most countries that rely on natural resources for prosperity seem to have a poorer outcome than those that rely on their human resources, their intellectual power, the capacity for innovation. And we have a tremendous capacity here in Canada for that. You think of all the things that have been invented here in Canada, from the Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone in Brantford, if the myth survives historical scrutiny, to modern AI, which was invented just up the street from where I'm sitting right now at the University of Toronto. So there are tremendous intellectual advantages that we have, over and above the resources as well. For the last, it's been more than just the length of the CUSMA U.S. Mexican Canada trade agreement, but going back to the auto pact of the early 1960s, there's been such integration in supply chains, particularly in the auto sector, that I think it would be an awful lot for American companies to unwind all that when they've got a pretty good thing going. And America has become the most prosperous nation on earth and is accelerating that lead. We've helped to fund that because we have been a relatively cheap source of manufacturing to help them on their way. So I think there's a lot that Canada has that would cost a lot for America to unravel.
Now, Brendan, we do just have about a minute left, but would the US's stance with CUSMA have any sort of effect on the stock market going forward?
Uh, Probably, but it's hard to say exactly what that would be. I think it won't affect the US stock market too much. But up here in Canada, again, I think there will be businesses that will do well as a result, and the ones that will do poorly perhaps as a result. I couldn't necessarily pick off the top, but mining resource companies should do well. Technology companies should do well, if for no other reason than they get bought out by larger American concerns. But I do think Canada focusing on our intellectual property, our brain power, our young people, and giving them the kind of capital market structure where they can grow businesses off their great ideas, I think that will be a huge competitive advantage for us going forward if we can pull it off.
Well, Brendan, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Theresa.